My sense is that different economies, depending on the population's choice, can operate with either a very large public sector or a very small one. And what matters is not the size of the public sector relative to private, but that the financing of both the public and the private be in balance. Now, we've seen in the last decade that both public and private financing can get out of line. In Europe, we have examples of some of the member states of the European Monetary Union that even before the current financial crisis were borrowing heavily, and more heavily than their economies could support. And so those are examples of the public sector being out of balance in its financing. And in my country, for example, we have a perfect example of the private sector being out of balance. Here we have both households and also the financial intermediary sector over-levering itself. And once again, the issue is not the size of the public sector versus the private sector, but in the U.S., the imbalance created by the revenues, that is to say, the earning power of households not matching the debt that households took mostly on their ownership of real estate, but on other spending as well. So the real point, I think, is to have the financing match the expenditures on an ongoing basis, and then different populations can have a different preference with respect to the size of the public sector versus the private. In the United States, for example, for the most part, our preference is to have a fairly small public sector, at least relative to many European countries. And indeed, in the United States, there are many people who would like to have the public sector be smaller than it is. But that's fine. And in European countries, there's a range, but for the most part, the public sector is larger relative to the size of the economy than it is in my country. And that's fine also. But the matter is not the mix between the two, but rather the financing within each one. I think the current situation in many countries, certainly including mine, presents a very serious danger for the health of the democratic system. Experience in many countries around the world shows that a crucial condition underlying the health of democratic freedoms is that the broad bulk of the population have a sense of moving forward in its material standard of living. And in the United States, for example, even before the financial crisis hit in 2007, 2008, 2009, it was already the case that the majority of Americans were not making forward progress in their incomes and living standards. So now, especially after the crisis, most Americans have incomes that are no higher than they were a decade and a half ago. Now, in Europe, the experience is very different from countries to country, but there are many countries where something roughly equivalent is the same. I believe that the history of the last 150 years shows that when the broad bulk of the population loses this sense of forward progress in its material living standard, and loses also the sense of optimism that that progress will continue, and also loses the confidence that even their children after them will regain this sense of forward progress, that's a circumstance in which in one country after another the experience has been rigidification, retrenchment, retreat, putting democratic values at risk. Now, you mentioned the 1930s. The 1930s is a very interesting episode because of the different paths taken in the face of a somewhat similar economic circumstance in Europe and in the United States. In Europe, as we all know, the reaction to this interruption of economic progress was move toward fascism in many countries, and a surrender to fascism in those countries that did not choose it. In the United States, it was rather different. In my work, one of the great puzzles that I've addressed is the reason that the experience of the United States in terms of broadening the democracy was so unusual in the 30s. The best guess that I have about why this is true, although it is just a guess, is that in the 30s in the United States, the economic crisis was so severe as to give people a sense that everybody was going down together. And alas, that is certainly not the case today, either in the U.S. or in Europe. In the United States, for example, there's an enormous amount of anger directed against the fact that the people whose actions were most responsible for the recent financial crisis and who in many cases profited the most from the recent financial crisis are precisely the people who are not suffering in the current economic stagnation. And I have the impression that, again, with appropriate differences from country to country, something similar is happening in Europe. When I read in the press that people in countries like Greece, for example, or Italy say, well, it's now necessary that we cut back and we sacrifice, I often wonder what is the sacrifice being offered individually by the people who so easily are saying we must sacrifice. So for all these reasons, I think what happened in the 1930s in the United States is, alas, not a very useful guide to what's likely to happen going forward. And fortunately, the degree of economic distress in most countries is nowhere near what it was in the 30s, although I am aware that unemployment is extraordinarily high in Spain, as high as it was in the United States in the 30s. But in most countries, that's not yet true. But the broader point is that when we have a situation like today, in which in many countries the broad cross-section of the population has no recent experience of moving forward in its material living standard, that's a circumstance in which the basic democratic freedoms are likely to be at risk.